In the quiet town of Millbrook, Connecticut, there stands a house that defies explanation. For 7 generations, every woman in the Ashcroft family who reached the age of 70 began the same ritual. They would rise in the dead of night, walk to the basement wall and whisper to the stone for hours until dawn. The neighbors called it dementia. The doctors called it hereditary madness. But when renovation crews tore down that wall in 2019, they discovered something that changed everything. Behind 3 feet of solid stone lay a hidden chamber, and inside that chamber were bones, hundreds of them, all belonging to children. Tonight, we delve into the Ashcroft family records, recently unsealed after decades of legal battles. What we've uncovered is not a story of mental illness, but of something far more sinister. A family secret so dark that 7 generations of women carried it to their graves, compelled by guilt and terror to confess their sins to a wall of stone night after night for over 200 years. The story begins in 1823, when Ezekiel Ashcroft purchased a modest colonial home on Elm Street in Millbrook. The house came with a peculiar history. Its previous owner, a reclusive widower named Cornelius Webb, had lived there alone for 30 years after his wife and 3 children died in what locals called a fever outbreak. Webb himself was found dead in the basement, clutching a hammer, surrounded by freshly mortared stones. The wall he had been building sealed off a section of the cellar that no one had ever seen completed. Ezekiel paid little attention to local gossip. He was a practical man, a merchant who dealt in imported goods from Boston. He moved into the house with his pregnant wife Margaret and their 2 young sons. The basement, he decided, would make an excellent storage area for his merchandise. The sealed wall, he reasoned, was simply Webb's attempt to reinforce the foundation. He never questioned why it had been built from the inside, or why the mortar still smelled faintly of lime and something else, something organic and unsettling. Margaret Ashcroft gave birth to their 3rd child, a daughter named Elizabeth, in the winter of 1824. It was a difficult birth, one that left Margaret bedridden for weeks. During her recovery, she began to hear things. Soft crying that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, children's voices calling for their mothers. At first, Ezekiel dismissed these reports as the hallucinations of a woman weakened by childbirth, but as Margaret grew stronger, the sounds grew louder. By spring, Margaret was walking the house at night, pressing her ear to walls, following sounds that only she could hear. She became fixated on the basement, spending hours sitting at the top of the stairs, listening. When questioned, she would only say that the children were frightened and needed comfort. Ezekiel, concerned for his wife's mental state, consulted the town doctor, who prescribed laudanum and rest, but the whispers continued. The first recorded incident occurred on September 15, 1824. Margaret's eldest son, Thomas, found his mother in the basement at 3 in the morning, kneeling before the sealed wall, her lips moving rapidly though no sound emerged. When he touched her shoulder, she startled violently, her eyes unfocused and wild. She claimed she had been sleepwalking, but Thomas noticed something that chilled him. The wall where his mother knelt was damp, though the basement was otherwise dry, and the dampness smelled of tears. Over the following months, Margaret's nocturnal visits to the wall became routine. She would rise precisely at midnight, walk to the basement in her nightgown, and remain there until dawn, sometimes whispering, sometimes weeping silently. Ezekiel installed a lock on the basement door, but Margaret somehow always found her way past it. She began to lose weight, her hair turned prematurely grey, and her eyes held a haunted quality that neighbors whispered about in the market square. Margaret never spoke of what she heard behind that wall, but her diary, discovered years later hidden beneath loose floorboards, revealed the horrifying truth. The entries, written in a shaking hand, described children's voices pleading for help, tiny fists pounding against stone, and a presence that demanded acknowledgement of terrible sins. Most disturbing of all were Margaret's repeated apologies, addressed to names that appeared nowhere in town records. Lucy, age 7, Benjamin, age 5, Sarah, age 9. Children who, according to Margaret's increasingly frantic writings, had been sealed alive behind that wall. Margaret Ashcroft died in 1857 at the age of 68, found one morning slumped against the basement wall, her fingers bloodied from clawing at the mortar. Her last diary entry, dated the night before her death, contained only one line: "I have told them I am sorry. Perhaps now they will let me sleep." Her death was attributed to a weak heart, though neighbors noted that her final words, whispered to the doctor who tried to revive her, were an apology to someone named Timothy. Elizabeth Ashcroft, Margaret's daughter, inherited the house and its terrible burden. Unlike her mother, Elizabeth was a stern, practical woman who ran the local schoolhouse with rigid discipline. She married a banker named Jonathan Hartwell and bore 3 children of her own. For years, she showed no signs of the affliction that had consumed her mother. She never spoke of hearing voices, never wandered the halls at night. The townspeople began to believe that whatever madness had plagued Margaret had died with her. They were wrong. On Elizabeth's 70th birthday in 1894, her eldest daughter Catherine found her grandmother in the basement, kneeling before the same wall, whispering frantically to the stones. When Catherine approached, Elizabeth's eyes were wild with terror and recognition. She grabbed her daughter's arm with surprising strength and hissed, "They're so young, so very young, and they know what we did." Catherine, confused and frightened, helped her mother back to bed, assuming the old woman had suffered some kind of episode. But the episodes continued. Every night, Elizabeth would rise and descend to the basement, drawn by compulsions she could not resist or explain. During the day, she was herself, teaching children and managing household affairs with her usual efficiency. But as darkness fell, something else took hold of her, a knowledge she had never possessed, but somehow inherited. She began to know the names of children who had died decades before her birth, their ages, their last words. She whispered apologies for crimes she had never committed, begged forgiveness for sins that belonged to another generation. Elizabeth's whispers were different from her mother's. Where Margaret had wept and pleaded, Elizabeth recited names like a litany, as if taking attendance in some ghostly classroom. Neighbors who lived close enough to the Ashcroft house reported hearing a woman's voice drifting from the basement windows in the early morning hours, methodically calling roll to students who would never answer. The pattern established by Margaret and Elizabeth would repeat itself through 7 generations of Ashcroft women. Each lived normal lives until their 70th year, when they would be seized by an irresistible compulsion to commune with the sealed wall. Each seemed to inherit knowledge they had never learned, memories of events they had never witnessed. Each whispered the same names, offered the same apologies, and eventually died with bloodied fingers and broken hearts. Catherine Hartwell, Elizabeth's daughter, began her vigil in 1924. By then, the family had begun to keep records of the phenomenon, desperate to understand what force drove their women to madness. Catherine's whispers were recorded by her son Robert, who sat outside the basement door with a notebook, transcribing everything he could hear. What he documented defied rational explanation. Catherine knew details about the Webb family that existed in no public record. She described the layout of the hidden chamber with architectural precision. Most unnervingly, she seemed to carry on conversations, pausing as if listening to responses that only she could hear. Robert's transcriptions revealed that Catherine's whispers followed a pattern. She would begin by calling out names: Lucy Webb, Benjamin Webb, Sarah Webb, Timothy Morse, Hannah Foster, Samuel Reed. Then she would describe how they died. "Lucy, you were only 7 when the sickness came. Benjamin, you hid behind the flour sacks. Sarah, you tried to help the little ones." Finally, she would beg forgiveness. "We should have come for you. We should have broken down the door. Forgive us for our cowardice." The records Catherine seemed to access suggested something far more sinister than a fever outbreak. According to her midnight recitations, Cornelius Webb had not lost his family to illness. During a scarlet fever epidemic that struck Millbrook in 1792, Webb had sealed his sick children and several neighbor children in the basement chamber, believing he could contain the disease. The children had died not from fever, but from starvation and suffocation, trapped behind a wall of their father's making, while their screams went unheeded by a town too frightened to intervene. Catherine's son, Robert, driven by his mother's revelations, began investigating the Webb family history. What he found corroborated his mother's impossible knowledge. Town records from 1792 showed an unusually high number of missing children during the scarlet fever outbreak. 7 families had reported children who simply vanished during the chaos of the epidemic. All had been playmates of the Webb children. All had been last seen in the vicinity of the Webb house. Robert's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered that his own family had connections to the tragedy. Ezekiel Ashcroft, the first of his line to own the house, had been a young merchant in 1792, part of a group of town leaders who made the decision to quarantine infected households. The records showed that Ezekiel had personally nailed boards across the Webb house door, sealing the family inside on the advice of a traveling physician who claimed containment was the only way to stop the spread of disease. The horror of realization struck Robert like a physical blow. His family's wealth, their position in the community, had been built on a foundation of cowardice and complicity. Ezekiel had not simply purchased a house with a dark history. He had helped create that history and then profited from it when Cornelius Webb's property was sold at auction to pay his debts. The Ashcroft family had literally built their fortune on the graves of children they had helped to seal away. Catherine's whispers grew more desperate as she aged, her voice becoming hoarse from nightly confessions. She began to scratch at the wall with her fingernails, leaving bloody marks on the stone. Her whispers turned to wails, her apologies to pleas for mercy. She spoke of cold hands touching her face, of children's breath on her neck, of eyes watching her from cracks in the mortar. The doctor who examined her in her final days noted that her fingernails were worn to the quick, her voice reduced to a rasp, and her eyes held a terror that seemed to come from witnessing unspeakable things. When Catherine died in 1954, slumped against the basement wall like her mother and grandmother before her, her last words were transcribed by Robert. "Please, little ones, I'm coming to join you soon. Don't be afraid anymore." The autopsy revealed no cause of death beyond extreme exhaustion and what appeared to be severe psychological trauma. Her heart had simply stopped, as if she had willed herself to die rather than face another night of whispered confessions. Robert's wife, Helen, took up the terrible inheritance in 1964. By then, the family had begun to prepare for each generation's ordeal, installing recording equipment in the basement, consulting with psychiatrists and paranormal investigators. Helen's whispers were captured on tape, providing the clearest record yet of what transpired during those midnight vigils. The recordings, preserved in the family archives, reveal conversations that seem to involve multiple participants, though Helen's voice is the only one audible to living ears. The tapes capture Helen acknowledging specific details about each child's death. How Lucy Webb had tried to comfort the younger children as the air grew thin, how Benjamin had scratched his name into the wall before losing consciousness, how Sarah had sung lullabies to keep the others calm. Most disturbing were the moments when Helen paused in her whispers, tilting her head as if listening to instructions. During these silences, the tape recorders picked up strange fluctuations in background noise, as if invisible voices were responding to her confessions. Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychiatrist Helen's family consulted, noted that she seemed to experience genuine conversations during her basement vigils. She would nod in response to unheard questions, shake her head in disagreement with invisible speakers, and sometimes laugh softly at what appeared to be children's jokes. Dr. Webb observed one of Helen's midnight sessions through a basement window and reported that she interacted with her environment as if it were populated by numerous individuals. She would turn to address different areas of the room, make space as if allowing someone to sit beside her, and even reach out to touch empty air with the tenderness of a mother comforting a child. Helen's contribution to the family records was her detailed drawings of the hidden chamber. Despite never having seen inside the sealed space, she produced architectural sketches that showed the room's dimensions, the placement of support beams, even the location of small personal items. Her drawings depicted a space approximately 12 feet square, with a low ceiling and stone walls. In her sketches, she showed children's belongings scattered on the floor, a wooden doll, a set of marbles, scraps of fabric that might have been blankets. Most chilling were her drawings of the walls themselves, covered in what she labeled as scratches and words left by dying children. As Helen aged, her drawings became more detailed and disturbing. She sketched the positions where each child had died, labeled with their names and ages. Her final drawing, completed just days before her death, showed the chamber filled with small, huddled figures, their faces turned toward the sealed entrance, as if still hoping for rescue that would never come. The fifth generation brought Margaret Ashcroft Reynolds, Helen's daughter, to the basement wall in 1994. By this time, the family had accumulated nearly 2 centuries of documentation about their inherited curse. Margaret, a retired librarian with a methodical mind, approached her ordeal with scientific rigor. She installed motion sensors, temperature gauges, and electromagnetic field detectors in the basement, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomena that drove her family to madness. Margaret's recordings revealed startling anomalies. The temperature in the basement dropped by 20 degrees during her whisper sessions, despite the heating system running normally. The electromagnetic detectors registered spikes of activity that coincided with her pauses in speech, as if invisible entities were manifesting in response to her words. Most remarkably, the motion sensors detected movement throughout the basement during her vigils, tracking what appeared to be multiple small figures moving around the sealed wall area. Margaret's whispers carried a different tone from her predecessors. Where previous generations had begged forgiveness, Margaret seemed to engage in teaching sessions. Her voice took on the patient cadence she had used when reading to children at the library. She would explain concepts like death and forgiveness to her invisible audience, describing the passage of time and how the world had changed since their deaths. Her sessions felt less like confessions and more like bedtime stories told to comfort frightened children. The technological evidence Margaret gathered convinced her that the phenomena were real, not hallucinations born of guilt and family expectation. She began corresponding with paranormal researchers, sharing her data and seeking explanations. Sarah Chen, a physicist studying consciousness and quantum mechanics, reviewed Margaret's evidence and proposed a theory that chilled the family to its core. Dr. Chen suggested that extreme trauma could create what she called psychic imprints that persisted across generations. The terror and guilt experienced by the dying children, combined with the hereditary shame of the Ashcroft family, might have created a form of consciousness that existed independent of physical death. This consciousness, trapped in the space where the children died, could potentially communicate with individuals who shared genetic or emotional connections to the original trauma. Margaret's final recordings, made in the weeks before her death, seemed to support Dr. Chen's theory. She spoke of making peace with the children, of helping them understand that they could move on to whatever lay beyond their earthly prison. Her voice grew weaker with each session, but also more serene, as if she were finally achieving something her ancestors had failed to accomplish. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep in 2019. The first Ashcroft woman in 7 generations not to be found dead against the basement wall. Her daughter Sarah, who had been preparing for her own eventual inheritance of the family burden, discovered something unprecedented in Margaret's final notes. Her mother had written that the children had finally forgiven the Ashcroft family, and that they were ready to go home if someone would simply open the door they had been sealed behind for over 2 centuries. Sarah Ashcroft Morrison faced a decision that none of her ancestors had confronted. Rather than wait for her 70th birthday to begin whispering to the wall, she decided to end the family's torment by tearing it down. In October 2019, she hired a construction crew to renovate the basement, instructing them to remove the sealed wall that had haunted her family for 7 generations. The workers broke through the mortar with sledgehammers, expecting to find either an empty space or perhaps some old foundation supports. What they discovered instead sent 2 men fleeing from the house and left the foreman calling police with shaking hands. Behind the wall lay a chamber exactly as Margaret had drawn it, containing the skeletal remains of 7 children, arranged in positions that suggested they had died holding each other for comfort. The bones were remarkably preserved, still wearing scraps of clothing that dated to the 1790s. Among the remains, investigators found personal items that matched the descriptions given by generations of whispering women: a wooden doll carved with the name Lucy, a pouch of marbles belonging to Benjamin, a small prayer book inscribed Sarah Webb, age 9. Most haunting were the scratches covering the walls, desperate messages left by dying children. "Mama, I'm scared. Please let us out. Tell Papa we were good." Indeed, the discovery made national news, transforming the Ashcroft family's private nightmare into a public fascination with America's hidden history. Forensic examination confirmed that the children had died of suffocation and dehydration, trapped in the sealed chamber for days or possibly weeks. Carbon dating of the mortar matched the 1792 timeline that family oral history had preserved with impossible accuracy. Sarah stood in the empty chamber after the remains were removed for proper burial, expecting to feel relief or closure. Instead, she experienced something she later described as profound peace. The basement, which had felt oppressive and cold for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly seemed lighter. The strange electromagnetic readings that had plagued the space for decades disappeared. Most remarkably, Sarah reported hearing children's laughter echoing faintly through the house, not the terrified cries her family had described, but the joyful sounds of children finally free to play. The 7 children were buried in Millbrook Cemetery in a ceremony attended by hundreds of townspeople and descendants of the original families. The Ashcroft family paid for individual headstones, each carved with the child's name and a message of love and remembrance. Sarah spoke at the service, reading aloud the names her family had whispered in darkness for 2 centuries, finally calling them into the light. But the story of the Ashcroft family does not end with burial and forgiveness. In the months following the discovery, Sarah began experiencing dreams that felt more like visitations. The children appeared to her not as traumatized victims, but as the happy, curious souls they had been before their tragic fate. They thanked her for setting them free, for giving them proper graves, for finally allowing them to rest. More surprisingly, Sarah began to understand the true nature of her family's inherited burden. The midnight whispers had not been a curse or punishment, but a calling. Each generation of Ashcroft women had been chosen to serve as guardians of the children's memory, to ensure they were not forgotten, to keep their names alive until someone could finally grant them peace. The apparent madness that had consumed her ancestors had actually been a form of sacred duty, a genetic predisposition toward compassion that made them capable of hearing voices others could not. The basement of the Ashcroft house stands empty now, converted into a memorial space where visitors can learn about the hidden tragedy that shaped 7 generations of women. Sarah has dedicated her life to researching similar cases, instances where family secrets and unresolved trauma create patterns of behavior that persist across generations. Her work has revealed dozens of families carrying burdens inherited from ancestors who witnessed or participated in historical injustices. The Ashcroft case has become a touchstone for understanding how guilt and trauma can transcend individual lifetimes, creating obligations that pass from parent to child, like genetic inheritance. Sarah's research suggests that many families carry similar burdens, manifesting as recurring dreams, compulsive behaviors, or unexplained knowledge about historical events their ancestors witnessed but never discussed. The town of Millbrook has embraced its dark history, installing a memorial garden where the Webb house once stood. The garden features 7 small headstones bearing the names of the children, surrounded by flowers and toys left by visitors who come to honor their memory. Local historians have expanded their research, uncovering other instances where fear and prejudice led to tragedies that were then covered up or forgotten. Sarah's final report on her family's experience includes a warning that resonates far beyond Millbrook. She writes that secrets have power, that unacknowledged guilt creates debts that must eventually be paid by someone. The Ashcroft women were not cursed by supernatural forces, but by the very human failure to confront uncomfortable truths about their family's past. Their midnight vigils were not symptoms of madness, but manifestations of a conscience that refused to let innocent suffering be forgotten. Today, the Ashcroft house stands as a reminder that the past is never truly buried, that the voices of the forgotten will find ways to be heard, even if it takes 7 generations and 200 years of whispered apologies in the dark. The children of the sealed chamber have finally found peace, but their story continues to echo, a warning about the price of silence and the power of secrets to shape lives long after their creators have turned to dust. In the end, the terrifying story of the Ashcroft family reveals a truth more unsettling than any ghost story, that the living are often more haunted by their own actions than by any supernatural force, and that the only way to break the cycle of inherited guilt is to face the darkness of the past and bring it into the light. The women who whispered to the wall were not mad. They were the keepers of a terrible truth, and their whispers were the sound of conscience refusing to be silenced.